My name is Lillian Price. I'm in my late 30s, and for most of my adult life, I've worked in environments where being calm, competent, and agreeable was considered a strength, as long as I never asked for too much space. I have been a strategist, a fixer, a person people relied on without ever really seeing. If you asked my colleagues how they'd describe me, they'd probably say steady, or easy to work with, or quietly reliable. None of those things is untrue. They're just incomplete. People often assume that because I don't raise my voice, I don't feel deeply. Because I don't express confidence loudly, I must not have it. I've learned that when you're observant instead of expressive, when you listen more than you speak, others tend to underestimate the weight of your internal world. They mistake stillness for passivity. They confuse patience with permission. This story isn't about revenge. It isn't about proving anyone wrong in a dramatic way. It's about a moment, actually a series of moments, that changed how I understood power, dignity, and timing. It's about what happens when you're quietly removed from a place you helped hold together, and how clarity can arrive without anger. HR told me I was being let go 5 minutes before a company town hall. That sentence alone sounds abrupt, almost surreal. And at the time, it felt exactly like that. Like being handed a private truth and then asked to smile in public. What followed immediately after is something I still think about often. I sat through applause knowing I was already gone. Not metaphorically gone, officially, decided, final. Over the course of this story, I'll walk you through what led up to that moment, not in a rush, and not with the benefit of hindsight pretending I knew everything all along. I want to be honest about what I missed, what I tolerated, and what I chose not to question until it was unavoidable. You'll hear about small cuts that didn't seem important at the time, roles that were quietly assigned without my consent, and the subtle ways respect can erode while productivity stays high. You'll also hear about restraint, about silence, not as submission, but as observation, about the difference between reacting and deciding. There are no villains twirling mustaches here, and there's no explosive confrontation at the center of this story. What happened unfolded slowly, almost politely, and maybe that's why it stayed with me. I'm sharing this not to dramatize loss, but to document a kind of emotional justice that doesn't announce itself. The kind that happens internally first. If you've ever felt invisible while being essential, if you've ever sensed a shift before anyone acknowledged it out loud, you might recognize parts of yourself here. Before we go any further, let me ask you one gentle question. Have you ever been in a room full of people, realizing you were already living a version of goodbye no one else could see? To them, I was dependable, not impressive in a way that sparked conversation, not disruptive enough to be threatening, just dependable. The kind of person whose name came up when something needed fixing, smoothing, or translating between departments that didn't speak the same language. I was the one looped in quietly, often late in the process, when things had already gone wrong and needed to be stabilized without drawing attention. I wasn't hired for visibility. I was hired for continuity. In meetings, I spoke when there was something precise to add. I didn't fill the silence to reassure myself. I didn't interrupt. I didn't perform urgency. Over time, that restraint became part of my brand, though no one ever called it that. It was just, Lillian will handle it, or she's solid, or she doesn't need much direction. That last one stayed with me. She doesn't need much direction, slowly turned into, she doesn't need much acknowledgement. I was trusted, but not credited. Relied on, but rarely consulted at the beginning, only at the end, when alignment was already assumed. My work lived in shared documents, process flows, and transition plans. Things that outlasted applause. I learned early that being low maintenance made people comfortable. Executives liked that I never surprised them emotionally. Managers appreciated that I didn't escalate unless it truly mattered. Teammates came to me privately because I listened without rushing to respond. In a workplace that rewarded visibility and confidence theater, I was something else entirely. Background structure. And structures are noticed most when they're gone. At performance reviews, my feedback was always consistent. You're incredibly reliable. You bring stability. You handle complexity well. There was praise, but it was contained, never expansive. I wasn't framed as high potential. I was framed as high capacity. Someone who could absorb more without complaint. I told myself that was fine. I wasn't chasing titles. I valued mastery. I liked knowing how things actually worked, beneath the org charts and polished decks. I liked being trusted with the unglamorous truth. But there's a subtle difference between being trusted and being taken for granted. I didn't recognize it at first because it doesn't arrive with hostility. It arrives with comfort, with familiarity, with assumptions. Assumptions like, Lillian will stay late if needed. Lillian won't mind if her project is reassigned at the last minute. Lillian doesn't need to be in this meeting. We'll fill her in later. Lillian is fine. I rarely corrected those assumptions. Part of me believed that consistency would eventually speak for itself. That quality had its own gravity. If I kept my head down and my standards high, recognition would follow organically. What I didn't realize was that I had been categorized, not as a leader in waiting, not as a risk, but as infrastructure. And infrastructure isn't promoted, it's optimized, maintained, replaced when budgets tighten. No one was unkind to me. That's important to say. There were no public slights, no cruel emails, just a gradual narrowing of how I was seen. My role became less about judgment and more about execution. Less about voice, more about output. I was present, but not central. Included, but not influential. And because I didn't object, because I continued to deliver with the same calm precision, it reinforced the story they had about me. That I was content. That I was steady. That I would always be there, quietly holding the edges together. Looking back, I can see how easy it was for them to misunderstand me. Silence is convenient to misread. Competence without ego feels infinite to those who benefit from it. At the time, though, I didn't feel wronged. I felt neutral, productive, slightly tired but proud of my work. I believed I knew my place, and that it was earned. I didn't yet understand how fragile that place was. The first time I noticed it, I told myself it didn't matter. It was a meeting I'd been part of for months, weekly, cross-functional, usually dry but important. I'd built the framework we were discussing, mapped the dependencies, and flagged the risks early. On the agenda, my name was listed under contributors, which was typical. I didn't need to lead the conversation to know my work was shaping it. That day, I joined on time, notebook open, listening as the director walked through slides that felt familiar. Not similar. Familiar. My language, my sequencing, even a diagram I recognized instantly, simplified but unmistakably derived from one I'd shared weeks earlier. As the conversation moved on, credit never came. No reference, no nod, just forward motion. I waited for a moment where it would make sense to clarify, to gently insert myself. But the meeting was efficient, tight, no pauses. And I told myself what I always did. It's fine. The work is what matters. Afterward, a colleague messaged me privately. Hey, great framework in the deck today. I stared at that sentence longer than I should have. I didn't respond right away. When I did, I wrote something neutral. Glad it's useful. That was the moment, small and almost invisible, when something shifted internally. Not anger, not even disappointment. Just awareness. This wasn't theft. It wasn't malicious. It was an assumption. The assumption that the work existed independently of me. That it was part of the company now, detached from its origin. I noticed similar moments after that. a document circulated without my name. A decision explained as if it had emerged organically, rather than from a series of careful analyses I'd provided. Each instance was minor enough to dismiss on its own. Together, they formed a pattern that was easy to ignore if you wanted to. And I did want to. I told myself I was being sensitive. In a collaborative environment, ownership was fluid. That leaders synthesized ideas. They didn't footnote them. I reminded myself that I wasn't there for validation. I was there to contribute. Still, I began to notice how often my presence was treated as optional. Meetings where I was invited late, or not at all, despite my role being directly impacted. Conversations that happened offline, and were summarized afterward, as if my input would have been redundant. Once I asked, carefully, why I hadn't been included in an early planning session. The response was immediate and friendly. "Oh, we didn't want to overload you. We know you've got a lot on your plate." It sounded considerate. It felt like a decision made about me, not with me. That distinction mattered more than I realized at the time. What made these moments difficult to name was how reasonable everything appeared. No one was hostile. No one raised their voice. In fact, everyone was very polite. The kind of politeness that makes you question your own discomfort. I didn't bring it up with my manager. I didn't document it. I didn't adjust my behavior. I continued to deliver exactly as I always had. On time, thorough, uncomplaining. In hindsight, that was the cut. Not the meeting. Not the missing credit. But my decision to absorb it quietly, to normalize the erosion before understanding its cost. I had learned long ago that calling attention to yourself could backfire. That being difficult was often a faster path to marginalization than silence. So I chose the safer route, the familiar one. I stayed useful, and usefulness, I was beginning to understand, can become a liability when it's no longer paired with visibility. The most unsettling part wasn't that my contributions were being overlooked. It was how easily everyone else seemed to accept that version of reality. As if the story they told about me had already been written, and I was simply fulfilling it. I didn't feel angry, I felt alert, and that, more than anything, was new. By the time I could name what was happening, it had already become routine. That's how normalization works. It doesn't announce itself as a problem. It settles in quietly, disguised as efficiency, as teamwork, as the unspoken understanding that some people simply don't need the spotlight. I told myself I was one of those people. I wore that belief like a badge, subtle, mature, professional. The small exclusions continued, and with each one I adjusted. When decisions were made without me, I adapted my plans instead of questioning the process. When my work was summarized by someone else, I corrected inaccuracies privately rather than publicly reclaiming authorship. When my role shifted slightly, less strategic input, more execution, I rationalized it as a phase, a response to organizational growth. I became fluent in justification. They're moving fast. It's not personal. This is just how leadership works. Each explanation helped me stay comfortable in a situation that was slowly shrinking around me. What I didn't realize was how much energy it took to keep that comfort intact. I began double-checking my tone in emails, softening language that was already measured. I stopped proposing ideas in open forums, choosing instead to share them one-on-one where they could be socialized first. An unspoken rule I'd never agreed to but now followed instinctively. I told myself I was being strategic, and maybe I was, but it was a strategy rooted in preservation, not growth. There was a moment, I remember it clearly, when a junior colleague presented an initiative during a department update. As she spoke, I recognized the structure immediately. The timeline, the risk mitigation approach, even the phrasing, mirrored something I'd shared with her weeks earlier in a mentoring session. As the room responded with enthusiasm, I felt something tighten in my chest. Not resentment toward her, she was doing exactly what she was encouraged to do, but a quiet realization. My influence was becoming invisible even to me. After the meeting, she thanked me profusely. I hope it was okay that I used some of what we talked about. I smiled. I told her it was more than okay. and I meant it. But I also noticed how easily the credit had transferred, how naturally the system rewarded the visible messenger over the silent source. I didn't bring this up either. Instead, I worked harder. I refined my outputs. I made my documentation clearer, more robust, and more self-explanatory. If my voice wasn't going to be heard, I wanted my work to speak flawlessly on its own. That impulse, to perfect rather than protest, was deeply ingrained. It had served me well in the past. It had earned me trust. But here, it was doing something else. It was training people to see me as interchangeable with the work itself. I began to notice how often I was described in functional terms. Lillian's good at keeping things on track. She's great with details. She's a strong support. Support. Not lead. Not drive. Support. No one said it with disrespect. That was the problem. Disrespect that arrives without malice is harder to challenge. It doesn't give you a clear villain, just a growing sense of misalignment between how you see yourself and how you're being positioned. I could have spoken up. I could have asked for clearer boundaries, for recognition, for a seat at the table earlier in the process. But each time the thought crossed my mind, it was followed by another, quieter one. Is this really worth it? The truth is, I was tired. Tired of navigating perception. Tired of calibrating my presence. Tired of wondering whether asserting myself would cost more than it gained. So I chose the path of least resistance. I normalized what felt wrong because it was easier than disrupting the equilibrium. What I didn't see then was that the equilibrium wasn't neutral. It was directional. It was slowly moving me out of the center of things, while I remained busy enough not to notice how far I'd drifted. By the time I admitted, to myself quietly, that something was off, it no longer felt new. It felt established, embedded, harder to reverse. And that perhaps was the most unsettling realization of all. Not that I was being diminished, but that I had participated in the process by making it easier for everyone else to look away. It didn't happen in a single conversation. No one sat me down and explained the role they had in mind for me. It emerged instead through repetition, through who was asked first, who was informed later, and who was expected to adapt without friction. I began to see it clearly once I stopped resisting the idea that it existed. I was the stabilizer, the person brought in when timelines slipped, when teams disagreed, when something needed to be fixed quietly without drawing attention. I was reliable in a way that made me safe, predictable, low risk. And because of that, I was rarely associated with change, only with continuity. In leadership meetings, my input was often framed as operational perspective, as if strategy lived somewhere else entirely. I was invited to weigh in on feasibility, not direction, on execution, not vision. At first, I accepted that distinction. Someone has to ground ideas in reality. Someone has to make sure the system holds. But over time, I noticed how that framing limited me. It subtly suggested that my role was to respond, not to initiate. When new initiatives were announced, I was often looped in after the fact. "We'll need your help implementing this," they'd say. Not, "What do you think?" Not, "How would you approach it?" The decision had already been made. My job was to make it work. And I did. I made it work so well that the role solidified around me like a mold. The more competent I was, the less they questioned whether I should be involved earlier. My effectiveness became evidence that the system was functioning as intended. There's a quiet irony in that. The role I was assigned wasn't demeaning. It was essential. But it was also contained. It had edges I wasn't meant to cross. I could influence outcomes indirectly, but I wasn't meant to shape narratives. I began to notice how often my manager spoke for me. In meetings, he'd summarize my position before I had a chance to speak. "What Lillian's saying is..." And while his interpretation was usually accurate, it reinforced a dynamic where my voice was mediated, not direct. I didn't interrupt. I didn't correct him. I nodded, added details when appropriate. I told myself it was efficient, that we were aligned. But alignment without agency is a fragile thing. Outside of meetings, I was praised for my attitude. "You're so flexible. You handle pressure really well. You don't make things political." Those comments were meant as compliments. And yet, each one subtly affirmed the role. The one who absorbs complexity so others can remain focused on the visible parts of leadership. I realized then that I had become valuable in a very specific way. I was the person who made transitions smooth, who reduced friction, who ensured continuity. I was not the person associated with disruption, ambition, or growth. And in an organization that was constantly restructuring, constantly optimizing, that distinction mattered. What unsettled me wasn't the role itself, it was how little room there was to evolve within it. The expectations were clear, even if they were never stated outright. I was expected to be competent, calm, and accommodating. To support decisions, not challenge them. To execute, not escalate. I had internalized those expectations so thoroughly that I rarely questioned them. They felt earned, familiar, safe. But safety, I was beginning to understand, can be a form of containment. The moment that crystallized this for me came during a planning cycle, when I proposed an alternative approach. Nothing radical, just a different sequencing that would reduce long-term risk. The room went quiet. Then someone said, lightly, "That's interesting, but let's stay focused on the plan." The plan, already decided. No one followed up with me afterward. No one asked me to elaborate. The suggestions simply disappeared. I didn't push, and in that moment, I recognized the role I had been assigned, not by title, but by expectation. I was there to ensure stability, not to introduce uncertainty. To maintain, not to redefine. Once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. The shift didn't come with an argument. There was no confrontation, no raised voices, no decisive email that forced clarity. It came in a moment so quiet that I almost missed it, one of those moments that only registers later, after it's already changed you. It was a Tuesday afternoon. I remember because my calendar was unusually light, a rare pocket of unscheduled time between meetings. I was reviewing a transition plan for a project I'd been deeply involved in from the beginning. Months of work, cross-team coordination, careful risk management. I knew the details intimately. Every dependency, every trade-off. An email notification appeared. It was a meeting invite for later that week. Strategy alignment. My name wasn't on it. At first, I assumed it was an oversight. It wouldn't have been the first time. I opened the attendee list, scanning quickly. The people listed were all senior to me, all familiar. The agenda was vague but unmistakably connected to the work I'd been leading. I sat there for a moment, cursor hovering, waiting for the familiar rationalizations to kick in. "They'll loop me in later. This is probably just a high-level discussion. I'll get the notes." But they didn't come. Instead, something else surfaced. A quiet, steady clarity. Not emotional, not reactive, just factual. This is intentional. That realization didn't hurt the way I might have expected. It didn't feel like rejection. It felt like confirmation. A data point that fit too neatly into a pattern I'd been avoiding naming. I didn't forward the invite to my manager. I didn't ask to be added. I didn't message anyone to check if it was a mistake. I closed my email, and for the first time in a long while, I stopped trying to interpret what they needed from me. I leaned back in my chair and asked a different question. One I hadn't allowed myself to ask before. What do I need to understand right now? The answer wasn't immediate, but the question lingered. I began reviewing my own work differently. Not as contributions to a collective goal, but as evidence. I looked at the decisions I'd influenced indirectly, the processes I'd built that others now operated without my involvement. I noticed how often my role was invoked in my absence, how plans assumed my availability, my compliance, my silence, and I realized something that felt both grounding and unsettling. I was no longer central to the future being discussed, even though I was essential to the present they were relying on. That disconnect mattered. I didn't feel angry. I felt awake. There's a difference. Anger wants resolution. Awakening wants understanding. That afternoon, I didn't confront anyone. I didn't draft a resignation letter. I didn't spiral. I simply observed. I listened more closely in the meetings I was in. I noticed who spoke, who summarized, and who decided. I paid attention to what questions were welcomed and which ones were gently redirected. I noticed how often certainty was rewarded over curiosity, and I noticed how rarely my name came up in conversations about the future, even when my work was central to it. That night, I went home and didn't talk about work at all. I cooked dinner, slowly. I washed the dishes by hand. I let the day settle without trying to resolve it. What shifted wasn't my loyalty. It wasn't my work ethic. It was my internal alignment. I stopped assuming that endurance would eventually be recognized. I stopped believing that staying quiet was inherently virtuous. I stopped conflating being needed with being valued. The next morning, nothing looked different from the outside. I showed up on time. I responded to emails. I delivered what was expected. But internally, something had recalibrated. I was no longer operating under the assumption that my place was secure simply because I was useful. I was no longer measuring my worth by how seamlessly I fit into a system that wasn't designed to expand around me. I didn't know what I would do with that clarity yet. I didn't need to. It was enough to let it exist without rushing to act. Because sometimes, the most important shift isn't a decision. It's the moment you stop lying to yourself about where you stand. After that day, my silence changed. Before, it had been reflexive. An instinct shaped by years of navigating systems where being agreeable kept things smooth. I stayed quiet because it felt safer, because it preserved harmony, because it allowed me to keep working without friction. Silence was something that happened to me. Now it was something I chose. That distinction altered everything. I still spoke when necessary, still contributed when asked, but the internal motivation had shifted. I was no longer trying to be understood or recognized. I was listening with intent, not accommodation, observing patterns rather than reacting to them. It surprised me how quickly others filled the space I left open. In meetings, when I didn't volunteer context or bridge gaps, the conversation often stalled. Assumptions surfaced. Gaps in understanding became visible. Not dramatically, just enough to register if you were paying attention. No one blamed me. They didn't even seem to notice the absence. They simply worked around it, made decisions with partial information, and moved on. And I took note. I stopped offering preemptive solutions. I answered questions directly, precisely, without expanding beyond what was asked. I resisted the urge to smooth over confusion that wasn't mine to resolve. Not out of spite, but out of discipline. For the first time, I was curious about what would happen if I didn't make things easier for everyone else. The result wasn't chaos, it was exposure. Processes I'd been silently holding together began to show strain. Dependencies were missed. Timelines slipped. Not catastrophically, but enough to create mild friction. And that friction revealed who truly understood the system and who had been relying on it without fully grasping its complexity. Still, no one connected this shift to me. They interpreted it through their own lenses: resource constraints, market pressure, growing pains. The narrative adjusted to accommodate the discomfort without challenging its assumptions. I remained calm, neutral, consistent. But internally, I was tracking everything. I began documenting more carefully, not just tasks, but interactions. Decisions made without input. Instances where my role was assumed rather than consulted. I didn't do this with the intention of building a case. I did it to see clearly. There's a difference. Clarity removes the emotional fog. It replaces speculation with evidence. And once you have evidence, you stop gaslighting yourself. I noticed how often my manager framed my reduced input as a sign of efficiency. "Lillian's got it handled," he'd say. Or, "She doesn't need to be involved at this stage." Those statements used to reassure me. Now they sounded like a distance. I didn't correct him. I also noticed how my availability was taken for granted. Last-minute requests, assumptions that I'd adjust my schedule without complaint. I still helped when it made sense, but I no longer rearranged my life to compensate for poor planning. When I declined, politely, professionally, the reaction was subtle but telling. Surprise, a pause, then acceptance, tinged with something like recalibration. They were updating their mental model of me slowly. Silence, I learned, creates space, and space forces others to reveal their expectations. I wasn't trying to send a message. I wasn't trying to provoke a response. I was simply no longer performing the role I'd been assigned without question. That restraint required effort. There were moments when it would have been easier to jump in, to fix things, to reassure. Moments when watching confusion unfold felt uncomfortable, but I reminded myself that discomfort wasn't damage. It was information, and information handled calmly is power. The most interesting change wasn't external, it was internal. I felt steadier, less reactive, less invested in outcomes that I didn't have a voice in shaping. I was no longer carrying the emotional weight of decisions made around me. I was present but not entangled. That posture, quiet, observant, deliberate, felt unfamiliar at first, but it also felt honest. I didn't know where this would lead. I wasn't planning an exit. I wasn't plotting anything. I was simply reclaiming my agency, one choice at a time. Silence had stopped being something that diminished me. It had become a boundary. What they never noticed was how much I was learning by saying less. When you stop filling in the gaps for others, you start to see exactly where those gaps are and who depends on you to keep them hidden. My quiet had created space, and in that space, patterns became unmistakable. I saw how decisions were made based on incomplete pictures, how confidence is often substituted for understanding, how certain people spoke early and often, not because they had clarity, but because they were rewarded for presence. Meanwhile, the systems beneath those decisions, systems I knew intimately, were treated as stable constants rather than fragile constructs. I began mapping those systems again, but differently this time. Not as contributions to a project, but as a record of reality. I revisited old documents, timelines, and approvals. I noticed how many critical decisions lived in private messages, hallway conversations, or undocumented calls. I saw how often I had been the translator between teams that didn't fully trust or understand each other. How many compromises had been brokered quietly to keep momentum going. And I noticed something else. How little of that institutional memory existed outside of me. There were process docs, yes, high-level summaries, but the nuance, the why behind decisions, the trade-offs that had been narrowly avoided, the reasons certain paths were closed off, those lived mostly in my head and my notebook. The slim black leather notebook I carried everywhere had always been a personal tool. Now, it has become something else. A timeline, a map, a reference point. I wasn't hoarding information. I wasn't hiding anything. I was simply no longer externalizing everything automatically. I paid attention to how often people assumed continuity without confirming it. We'll just do what we did last time. This should be straightforward. I'm sure Lillian's already thought about that. Those statements used to feel like trust. Now they sounded like dependency without awareness. I began asking more questions, not challengingly, just precisely. Questions that revealed assumptions. Questions that slowed things down just enough to expose complexity. I watched who leaned in and who grew impatient. I noticed who valued accuracy and who valued speed. At the same time, I started preparing quietly, not for revenge, for independence. I updated my records, clarified my own understanding of my contributions, documented my work in a way that was complete but not interpretive. Facts, dates, decisions, dependencies, nothing dramatic, nothing accusatory. I also began conversations outside my immediate sphere, carefully, professionally. Not about grievances, but about trajectories, about how organizations change, about what happens when systems grow faster than accountability. I listened more than I spoke. What I learned was sobering but useful. Restructures were being discussed. Budgets were tightening. Roles were being evaluated not on impact, but on visibility and narrative alignment. I understood then why my silence had gone unnoticed. I wasn't part of the story they were telling about the future. That realization didn't hurt the way it once might have. It clarified things. It told me where not to invest emotional energy. I stopped assuming continuity. I stopped planning as if my presence was guaranteed. I began thinking of contingencies. What would happen if I weren't here? Not hypothetically, practically. Which projects would stall? Which teams would struggle to translate priorities? Which decisions would lack historical context? I didn't share these questions. I answered them privately. There was a strange calm in that preparation. It wasn't driven by fear. It was driven by respect. For myself, for the work I'd done, and for the reality of the system I was in. They never noticed the shift because it didn't disrupt anything immediately. I was still performing, still professional, still present, but I was no longer cushioning the organization from the consequences of its own assumptions. And that made all the difference, because when you prepare quietly, without announcement or resentment, you don't just protect yourself. You reclaim authorship over what happens next. They thought my silence meant I was disengaged. What they never noticed was that it meant I was finally paying full attention. The reveal didn't come from an email or a conversation or anything dramatic. It came from sitting alone one evening, my notebook open, reviewing a sequence of decisions I'd documented over the years. I wasn't looking for leverage. I wasn't trying to uncover wrongdoing. I was simply trying to understand the system as it actually existed, not as it was described in meetings. That's when I saw it. A pattern so clear, so consistent, that it stopped feeling theoretical. There were entire initiatives, high-risk, high-visibility ones, that depended on assumptions I had personally negotiated into place. Not formally approved policies, not codified agreements, but carefully balanced compromises. Agreements between teams that didn't trust each other. Workarounds that had prevented escalation. Dependencies that were stable only because someone was actively maintaining them. Me. What struck me wasn't that this knowledge made me powerful. It was how fragile everything was without it. The organization believed it had systems. In reality, it had understandings. And many of those understandings lived nowhere officially. They lived in memory, context, timing, and judgment. They lived in conversations I'd had, decisions I'd delayed, conflicts I'd softened before they hardened into something legal or reputational. I realized then that my role hadn't been operational at all. It had been relational. I had been absorbing risk, not heroically, quietly, repeatedly, without acknowledgement. And I had done it so well that the risk had become invisible. That was the private reveal. Not that I was indispensable, but that the organization didn't know where its own fragility points were. They believed redundancy existed because roles were documented. But redundancy only works when context is transferable. Much of this context wasn't. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt sober. Because leverage like this isn't something you celebrate. It's something you handle carefully. Misused, it becomes manipulation. Exposed too early, it gets neutralized. Ignored, it dissolves along with you. I closed the notebook and sat with that understanding for a long time. I thought about my moral code, the one I'd lived by without articulating. Never embarrass others to protect yourself. Never create chaos to feel powerful. Never weaponize information simply because you can. This wasn't about forcing recognition. It wasn't about control. It was about choice. For the first time, I understood that staying silent wasn't just passive. It was active containment. I had been holding complexity together out of habit, not obligation. And I could stop. Not abruptly, not destructively, but deliberately. The private reveal wasn't shared with anyone. It didn't change how I behaved outwardly. I didn't hint at it. I didn't protect it aggressively. I simply acknowledged it internally and adjusted my sense of responsibility. I stopped feeling personally accountable for outcomes I wasn't invited to shape. That shift was subtle but profound. In the weeks that followed, I noticed how often decisions were made without checking feasibility against reality. how frequently leaders assumed alignment that hadn't been confirmed, how many plans depended on, "We'll figure it out later." Later had always been me. Now later was uncertain. I didn't interfere. I didn't warn. I didn't sabotage. I continued to answer questions honestly when asked, but I stopped anticipating needs that weren't expressed. And slowly, gently, the system began to feel the difference. Nothing broke, but nothing felt as smooth. I watched with a kind of detached interest. Not because I wanted failure, but because I needed to see how much of my presence had been invisible scaffolding. The answer was more than I had allowed myself to acknowledge. The private reveal wasn't a moment of empowerment. It was a moment of recalibration. I finally understood the true shape of my value, not as a title, not as a role, but as accumulated judgment. Judgment that had never been formally recognized, only quietly relied upon. And that understanding made one thing very clear. Whatever came next, I would not continue giving that away unconsciously. Knowing something and acting on it are very different things. For a while, I stayed in the space between them. I didn't rush. I didn't dramatize the choice in my head. I simply laid out the options as they actually were, not as I wished they would be. Option 1 was to speak up. I could request a formal conversation, ask for clarity around my role, my future, and my visibility. I could present my contributions, articulate the risks I'd been managing, and ask to be included earlier in strategic decisions. It was a reasonable option, a professional one, but it relied on a few assumptions I no longer felt confident in. That recognition would be met with recalibration, not defensiveness. That the system was flexible enough to expand rather than reframe. That I would be heard without being labeled difficult or self-promoting. Option 2 was to stay exactly where I was, continue performing, continue absorbing risk, continue being relied upon quietly. This option offered short-term stability, predictability, familiarity, but it also meant accepting that my value would remain undocumented and therefore expendable. That was no longer acceptable to me. Option 3 was to leave, not impulsively, not in protest, but with intention. To step out of a system that had defined me in ways I didn't choose, and to do so on my own terms. This option was the most disruptive internally, not to the organization, but to my identity. I had built a sense of self around being reliable, steady, and embedded. Leaving meant redefining who I was without that context. I sat with these options longer than I expected. What made the decision difficult wasn't fear. It was loyalty. To people, to work, to the version of myself that had believed in quiet contribution. But loyalty without reciprocity becomes self-erasure. That realization didn't arrive with anger. It arrived with sadness. A clean, uncomplicated sadness that didn't ask to be fixed. I thought about timing, about leverage, about consequences. If I spoke up, the system might adjust just enough to keep me in place. Offer reassurance. Minor concessions. A reframing of my role that preserved appearances without changing dynamics. If I stayed silent indefinitely, the system would continue optimizing around my invisibility until my role could be removed entirely. If I left, the impact would be delayed, not immediate. The absence would be felt gradually, in moments of confusion and misalignment. Not dramatically, just enough to matter. I knew then which option was irreversible, and irreversibility, I realized, was the point. Not because I wanted to burn bridges, but because I wanted to stop negotiating my own worth internally. I wanted a decision that aligned my actions with my clarity. Leaving didn't mean abandoning my principles. It meant honoring them. I didn't tell anyone yet. I didn't announce my decision. I simply acknowledged it to myself and began aligning my behavior accordingly. I stopped planning long-term initiatives. I stopped volunteering for future-facing projects. I focused on closing loops, documenting what was appropriate, and maintaining professionalism without overextension. I prepared quietly, respectfully. There was a sense of calm in that preparation, a finality that didn't feel dramatic, just settled. The decision point wasn't a single moment. It was a threshold I crossed gradually, until one day I realized I was already on the other side of it. I had chosen not to ask for permission to be seen. I had chosen to step away from a system that mistook my silence for consent. And once that choice was made, everything that followed felt inevitable. Once the decision was made, I became very careful with my energy. Not withdrawn, not cold, just precise. I didn't announce anything because there was nothing to announce yet. Decisions made too loudly invite interference. I had learned that systems respond to noise, not nuance. So I moved quietly, the same way I always had. Only this time, it was for myself. I began by tightening boundaries. I stopped saying yes automatically. I asked clarifying questions before committing. I declined work that extended beyond my formal responsibilities, always politely, always with a rationale that couldn't be challenged without exposing poor planning elsewhere. No one objected. They adjusted. That adjustment told me everything I needed to know. I reviewed my employment agreement carefully, not with suspicion, but with respect for process. I made sure I understood notice periods, severance language, and intellectual property clauses. I didn't consult a lawyer. I didn't need to. I wasn't planning a fight. I was planning alignment. Financially, I made quite a few preparations. I increased my savings buffer, deferred a few discretionary expenses, not out of fear, but out of self-respect. Independence is easier when you're not rushed. At work, I focused on closure. I documented processes that should have been documented long ago. Clean, factual, non-editorial. Enough to be responsible, not enough to replace judgment. I resisted the impulse to over-explain. That was important. Over-explaining would have softened the transition for everyone else at the cost of erasing the reality of my role. I wasn't obligated to leave the system better than I found it, only not worse through neglect or sabotage. So I left it honest. In meetings, I stayed neutral. I didn't challenge decisions that no longer involved me. I didn't volunteer alternative paths. When asked directly, I answered truthfully and briefly. People interpreted my calm as disengagement. They were wrong. I was more present than ever, just no longer emotionally invested in outcomes I didn't control. What surprised me was how little resistance there was. No one checked in to ask if everything was okay. No one noticed the shift in my availability as anything other than efficiency. That told me the system had already mentally prepared for my absence. Without acknowledging it consciously, there's a strange quiet that settles in when you stop trying to be understood by people who never fully saw you. A lightness. Not happiness exactly. Relief. I didn't talk about my plans with colleagues. Not because I didn't trust them, but because I didn't need validation. This wasn't a performance. It was a transition. I did, however, start having conversations outside the company, discreetly. Exploratory. Not job hunting in the traditional sense, but reconnecting with my sense of professional identity beyond one environment. Those conversations reminded me of something I had forgotten. That my value was legible elsewhere. That clarity isn't universal, but it exists. Still, I didn't rush. Moving in silence isn't about secrecy, it's about timing. And timing, I had learned, is everything. I continued doing my job well. Not exceptionally. Well, there's a difference. Excellence in systems like this attracts dependence. Competence allows exit. As weeks passed, I noticed small signs of recalibration around me. My manager stopped assuming my availability. Certain projects were reassigned without discussion. Decisions continued without my input. Nothing dramatic, just alignment catching up to reality. And I let it, because when you stop resisting the direction things are already moving in, you conserve strength for what comes next. By the time HR scheduled a quick sync on my calendar, no context, just 15 minutes, I wasn't surprised. I didn't know the exact words they would use. I didn't know the timing, but I knew the outcome. And I was ready, not emotionally hardened, not triumphant, just prepared. The first consequence wasn't immediate, and it wasn't loud. It arrived as a question, a message from a program lead I hadn't worked closely with in months. Hey, quick check. Do you know why Team B is blocked on this dependency? We thought it was resolved. I read it carefully. I knew exactly why. I had resolved it, temporarily, by negotiating a workaround that required ongoing coordination. Coordination had quietly stopped when my involvement was reduced. I responded honestly. It was resolved under the previous assumptions. Those may no longer be in place. There was a pause, then a follow-up. Can you clarify? I did. Briefly, factually, without volunteering to fix it. That pattern repeated. Small questions. Minor confusion. Requests for context that assumed continuity where none existed. Each time, I answered clearly, without stepping back into the role of stabilizer. And each time, the system absorbed the friction without naming its source. At first, people framed it as transition noise, growing pains, misalignment. We'll sort it out. But sorting it out required time, meetings, escalations. Decisions that used to be resolved quietly now needed visibility. And visibility has a cost. I noticed how often my name came up in my absence. Not with blame, but with uncertainty. Didn't Lillian handle this before? I thought she had context on that. Maybe we should ask her. Sometimes they did ask. Sometimes they didn't. When they did, I answered. When they didn't, I didn't insert myself. The most interesting shift was in how leaders responded. Without a single point of quiet coordination, they were forced to confront complexity directly. Trade-offs that had been softened now felt sharper. Decisions took longer. Confidence wavered. Still, no one reached out to me to ask why things felt harder. They treated the friction as environmental, not structural. And that's when I understood something important. Systems rarely recognize what they've lost until replacement fails. The applause still happened. Town halls still celebrated progress. Slides still moved forward optimistically. But underneath, there was a subtle loss of coherence. I watched this without satisfaction or resentment. Just observation. I didn't want them to fail. I wanted to see the truth. And the truth was that my absence, partial, quiet, unannounced, was already being felt, even before it was official. People began copying me on emails again, inviting me to meetings they'd previously excluded me from, asking for a quick gut check. I declined some, accepted others, not strategically, honestly. If the question related to work I was still responsible for, I engaged. If it assumed a role I was no longer playing, I redirected. That inconsistency unsettled them. They were used to my reliability being total. Now it was bound, and boundaries force recalibration. The consequences weren't dramatic enough to trigger alarm bells, but they were persistent enough to register. I could feel the system straining, not breaking, just adjusting awkwardly to a missing element it hadn't realized was load-bearing. Still, nothing changed structurally. No one revisited role definitions. No one acknowledged the shift. Because acknowledgement would require admitting that something essential had been informal, undocumented, and taken for granted. It was easier to keep moving, and so they did. Right up until the moment they couldn't. The panic didn't arrive all at once. It crept in through tone. Emails that used to be concise grew longer, more careful. Meeting invites multiplied. Agendas became crowded with words like alignment, clarification, and risk review. The system was no longer gliding. It was compensating. I noticed it first in my manager. He began checking in more frequently, not directly about me, but about how things were feeling. Open-ended questions, casual curiosity, the kind that sounds supportive but arrives a little too late. Just want to make sure you're not overloaded, he said once, during a one-on-one that hadn't existed in weeks prior. I told him the truth. I'm managing my scope. He nodded, as if that settled something. But it didn't. Projects that had been declared on track began surfacing issues that couldn't be smoothed over quietly. Teams disagreed publicly. Dependencies were questioned instead of assumed. Leaders found themselves explaining decisions they hadn't fully understood when they made them. And still, no one named the root cause. They tried to fix it with a process. New checklists, more meetings, temporary task forces, external consultants brought in to assess operational gaps. I watched those efforts with a strange mix of detachment and familiarity. They were formalizing what had once been handled informally. By me. At one point, I was invited to a meeting explicitly labeled knowledge transfer. The irony wasn't lost on me. I attended. I answered questions. I explained what could be explained in that format. But judgment doesn't transfer cleanly. Context doesn't compress. And you can't retrofit trust once the conditions that sustained it are gone. The frustration became visible. Deadlines slipped. Decisions were revisited. The confidence that had once characterized leadership communications gave way to hedging language. We're exploring. We're evaluating. We're reassessing. During one particularly tense meeting, someone said, half-jokingly, "It feels like we're missing a piece of the puzzle." No one responded, because acknowledging which piece was missing would require acknowledging how it had been handled. My manager asked, eventually, if I'd be open to taking on a more strategic role again. The phrasing mattered. Again. As if strategy had ever been something I'd opted out of, rather than something I'd been quietly excluded from. I didn't respond immediately. I asked what that would look like. The answer was vague. More visibility. More input. A chance to reset expectations. It was everything I might have wanted months earlier. But timing is not a technicality. It's the substance of respect. I told him I'd think about it. I already knew the answer, because by then, the conditions had changed. Trust had thinned. The system was reacting, not reflecting. And I was no longer willing to step back into a role that only expanded when it was convenient. They weren't trying to fix the underlying issue. They were trying to restore a function, and I had stopped being a function. The final attempts were subtle but earnest. Inclusion in meetings. Requests for perspective. Compliments framed as rediscovery. We really value your insight. You've always had a great grasp of the big picture. I listened. I thanked them. I didn't reattach. Because repair without accountability is just repetition. By the time HR reached out, the organization had already exhausted its quiet options. What remained was a formal process, clean, impersonal, irreversible. They called it a restructuring, a realignment, a difficult but necessary decision. And perhaps it was. But what struck me wasn't the decision itself. It was how many things they tried to fix after they realized they could no longer rely on what they'd never named. By then, it was too late. Not because I wanted it to be, but because clarity, once integrated, doesn't reverse itself. You can't unknow your value, and you can't re-enter a system that only sees you when it's already in trouble. The HR meeting was scheduled for 15 minutes. No subject line. Just a neutral calendar block titled Quick Sync. By the time it appeared on my screen, I already knew what it was. Not intuitively, structurally. Every system announces its conclusions before it speaks them. When I joined the call, there were 3 faces. HR, my manager. Someone from leadership I'd interacted with only a handful of times. Everyone looked composed. Serious, but kind. The tone was rehearsed in the way professionalism often is when the outcome is final. They didn't waste time. This isn't a reflection of your performance. I nodded. Not because I agreed, but because the sentence wasn't meant to be evaluated. It was meant to soften the impact. They explained the restructure, the shifting priorities, the redundancy of my role. Language designed to remove agency from the decision, as if it had emerged naturally rather than been chosen. I listened without interrupting. As they spoke, something unexpected happened. I didn't feel defensive. I didn't feel blindsided. I felt present. Fully. Calmly. As if my body had already processed what my mind had known for weeks. When they finished, there was a pause. The kind that invites reaction. I didn't give them one. I thanked them for explaining the context. I asked a few clarifying questions. Logistics, timeline, next steps. My voice was steady, neutral, precise. At one point, my manager said, "We really wish this had worked out differently." I looked at him, just long enough to acknowledge the sentiment. "I understand," I said. And I did. Understanding doesn't require agreement. There was no accusation, no listing of contributions, no attempt to reframe the narrative. I didn't need to defend my value to people who had already decided how to categorize it. The confrontation, if it could be called that, was quiet. What they expected, I think, was emotion, disappointment, surprise, a request for reconsideration, something to respond to. What they got was acceptance without surrender. Before the call ended, HR explained the severance terms. Reasonable, clean, standard. I asked for everything in writing, not adversarially, just responsibly. They agreed. When the meeting ended, I sat at my desk for a moment longer than necessary. Not to process grief, but to register closure. 5 minutes later, I joined the company-wide town hall. Cameras on. Applause in the chat. Smiling faces. Leadership celebrating milestones. Thanking teams. Projecting momentum. And there I was, sitting through applause, knowing I was already gone. Not in a dramatic way, in a factual one. No one on that call knew. Not yet. To them, I was still part of the picture. Still a name on a slide somewhere. Still assumed. The contrast was striking, not painful, just clear. I watched people cheer for progress I would no longer be part of. I listened to language about alignment and future vision that no longer included me. And I felt no urge to correct the record. That was the final confrontation. Not with them, but with the version of myself that once believed belonging was something you earned by staying quiet. I closed my laptop when it ended. Not abruptly, gently. The moment didn't need punctuation. After the announcements were made and the logistics began to move forward, I expected a sense of loss to arrive. It didn't. What arrived instead was quiet. Clean, unburdened quiet. The kind that comes when you stop holding something together with your own body. In the days that followed, I noticed how often people reached out with confusion rather than sympathy. I didn't realize your role was affected. This feels sudden. You were so central. How does this even work without you? I answered kindly, briefly, without filling in the gaps, because those gaps were no longer mine to manage. What surprised me most was how quickly my identity recalibrated once I was no longer inside the system that had defined it. I wasn't scrambling to replace a title. I wasn't rushing to prove continuity. I felt intact. For the first time in years, my sense of worth wasn't tied to being useful on demand. I began taking stock, not of what I'd lost, but of what I no longer carried. I no longer carried other people's urgency. I no longer carried decisions I hadn't been allowed to influence. I no longer carried the quiet responsibility of preventing consequences no one else wanted to acknowledge. That release made room for something else. Clarity. I began reconnecting with work on my own terms. Not immediately. I didn't jump into the next thing. I gave myself space to feel the shape of my own attention again, to notice what pulled at it naturally, without obligation. I realized how much of my intelligence had been spent translating, cushioning, and anticipating. How little had been spent expanding. Without the constant background noise of institutional maintenance, my thinking deepened. Slowed. Focused. I wasn't angry. I wasn't vindicated. I wasn't even relieved in the dramatic sense. I was aligned. When people asked how I was doing, I answered honestly. I'm steady. That word, familiar as it was, finally belonged to me rather than to a role. I didn't rewrite the past as betrayal. I didn't need to. The past made sense once I stopped romanticizing endurance. What I understood now was simple. Being calm, competent, and quiet is not a flaw. But it becomes one when you allow others to benefit from it without recognizing your agency. I hadn't lost myself in that organization. I had misplaced myself temporarily, and finding myself again didn't require confrontation or reinvention. It required permission. To stop performing stability for others and start practicing it internally. I didn't walk away with bitterness. I walked away with discernment. I now notice how quickly systems reveal what they value. Not through praise, but through protection. Through whom they make room for when things get tight. And I choose differently. I spoke earlier. I ask clearer questions. I don't wait to be invited into rooms where my judgment is relevant. And if I'm not welcome, I don't contort myself to fit. I'm still calm, still thoughtful, still deliberating. But I am no longer invisible to myself. That, more than any outcome, feels like resolution. There's a particular kind of ending that doesn't announce itself. No dramatic reversal. No public reckoning. No moment where everyone suddenly understands what they lost. This was that kind of ending. What stayed with me wasn't the meeting with HR, or even the town hall where I sat through applause, knowing I was already gone. What stayed with me was the clarity that followed, the kind that settles slowly, then stays. For a long time, I believed dignity came from endurance, from being the person who didn't need recognition, who could absorb pressure without complaint, who kept things moving no matter what. I thought restraint was synonymous with strength. I was half right. Restraint is strength when it's chosen. Silence is power when it's owned. But when restraint becomes expectation, and silence becomes convenience for others, something essential erodes. Not loudly, gradually. What this experience taught me is that systems rarely reward quiet integrity on their own. They reward what is visible, narratable, and easy to replace. And that doesn't make them evil. It makes them predictable. The danger isn't in being underestimated by others. The danger is underestimating yourself long enough that you start cooperating with it. I don't share this story to warn you against being loyal, or kind, or composed. I share it to say this: none of those qualities requires self-erasure. None of them requires waiting indefinitely for recognition that may never come. Sometimes emotional justice doesn't look like winning. Sometimes it looks like leaving with your clarity intact. I didn't walk away with applause. I walked away with authorship over my own next chapter. And that matters more than being remembered correctly by a system that never fully saw you to begin with. If you're listening to this and recognizing yourself, the one who holds things together quietly, who makes it easier for everyone else to function, who is relied on but rarely centered, I want you to hear this clearly. Your calm is not infinite, your competence is not consent, and your silence is only noble when it's voluntary. Pay attention to who checks in before things break. Notice who asks for your thinking, not just your execution. And ask yourself honestly whether the space you're in expands when you bring your full judgment into it. If it doesn't, that's not a failure. It's information. And information, when handled without bitterness, becomes freedom. Before we end, I'd like to leave you with a question, not to answer quickly, but to sit with. Have you ever realized, quietly, all at once, that a place you were holding together had already decided it didn't need to hold you? If so, I'd love to hear how you recognized it and what you chose to do next.